Hello everyone, and welcome to Artists for Everyone here on YouTube this week. And I would like to say that if you want to visit my Patreon, there is a reference image for this week's project. It is available to all, not just my patrons, so you can go on there and download the reference image for this project, and I highly suggest it. It would help you a lot. So you can do that and then come back here and we can do the rest of the video. If you want to visit my Patreon, there is a link in the description box below, but you can also go to patreon.com/Kateri Ewing. Okay, you can also search for me once you're on Patreon, but there is a reference image for this week's project on Patreon. So, and while you're there, take a look around. I don't know if you can really see things, but you can see how busy we are. We have a good time there. So this week, we are going to paint mushrooms. My dad brought me these beautiful, beautiful mushrooms from Michigan. And it's real, and they are edible, and they came from a mushroom farm. But they're really lovely, and mushrooms are one of my favorite things to paint at this time of year. And I will bring in specimens from my woods and paint them. I don't touch them. I can touch these because they're edible. But if I pick mushrooms from my woods, I pick them with rubber gloves, put them in a plastic baggie, and I leave them there to paint. Because you never want to touch a poisonous mushroom. And I just don't know that much about them. So I just never touch them. I use a plastic glove in a plastic bag, and they stay there. So anyways, but this week, I thought we would paint mushrooms, and this particular mushroom is a really great one to start with. It's not too tricky of a shape. It's got some beautiful texture, and the colors are very soft. And but there is a little bit of interest, so we can start with something simple, which is what I always like to do in our Artists for Everyone videos. So why don't you go over to Patreon and download the reference image, and then what I want you to do, if you want, you can make a small drawing. The reference image, the mushroom should not be any bigger than 3 inches high. And then you can print that out or look at it on your screen and then draw your mushrooms on your paper from your reference image. I will also go ahead and do the drawing for you right now. So I am looking at my mushroom. I'm going to hold it in my hand, and it's about like this. And I'm going to start with a 2H pencil. An HB pencil is fine, and I'm just going to sort of draw the shape of the cap. We don't have to be exact. It's kind of a flattened oval. Okay, so I don't want to draw this too dark, so that's why you have a reference image. All right, so you can look at it too. So I've got that, and then from underneath that, we're going to start drawing the stem down. It kind of curves. And again, this does not have to be exact, because just by looking at it carefully and trying to draw what we see, we're going to get something that looks like a mushroom. Okay, so there's that one. And then just a little bit down here, about this far down, I've got the other cap, and it touches this one, and it goes up and down. And then those two meet, and then this one comes this way. See how I'm just sketching along what I see? And then the two mushrooms meet and come down. This one comes down, and then this comes out. And we don't have to be too particular with the bottom. We're just gonna draw sort of a line across. There's like this little circular thing here and it comes down. I don't know the right terminology. And then there's another little shape here. So do you see how I'm not being exact? I can be. If I wanted to be, I could be. All right? Then there's this little slice, sort of like that. And then in this one, you can see this little indentation, and we'll just lightly put that into our mushroom. There. And that is good enough. Okay? So I look here, and it kind of comes up and down, and then this part sort of goes behind. And it's the same thing over here. It comes down, and then we're looking at the underside of the mushroom. So we can always adjust. All right, and that one's about right. Okay, so I'm going to use my eraser now, and I'm going to just lightly erase over my drawing. Anything that I don't need. And just sort of lighten up my lines, because mushrooms are really pale and we don't want to have those dark pencil lines. So I just took up a little bit of my drawing. So this is going to be very pale, all right? But I want you to take a look at it. And I'm going to stop the video and take a picture and drop that in so that you can take a look at it and take a screenshot if you need to see a reference image. But you've got of the line drawing, but you have the reference image of the mushrooms that you can use to make your own drawing. These are not hard to draw, but sometimes we have to work at it for a few minutes, okay, until we get the right shapes. All right, so I'm going to stop the video and take a picture, and then I will drop it in, and then we'll start again. Okay, so you saw my line drawing and you have your reference image, and now I'm going to talk about the supplies. So I'm using a cold pressed paper. You can use any cold pressed paper. This happens to be Stonehenge Aqua Cold Press, and it's a 9 by 12 block. I also have a little palette so I can mix my paints in that, so even a white dinner plate is fine, or a little white salad plate. I have an eraser. I have a pencil that we drew with. We don't need that anymore. I've got two brushes here. I have a number 6 pointed round and a number 4. So anything like that would be fine. I have my beautiful, beautiful Artists for Everyone palette from Wildthorn. As always, if you don't have this set, I give substitutions, okay, in the description box. And then I also have a jar of water, and I have some paper towels to wipe my brush. And I have my mushroom, or you would have your reference. So that's all we need. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mix up our color. So I'm going to move my paper over and bring my palette in. And we're going to, it's pretty simple, okay? So we definitely need a lot of Buff Titan. And Buff Titan is, it's sort of an ecru colored titanium white. So if you have titanium white, you could just add a little touch of yellow ochre and raw umber to make sort of a creamy white. And we're going to put it in our palette and add lots of water to it. I'm putting lots of water because I want it to be nice and pale. Okay, so I have a, see how I have a nice big puddle of it. A little bit more water. All right? And then we're going to be using the raw umber. So I'm going to put raw umber into another well. And that's about enough. And then just some water to just make it a little bit more transparent. So I just got through painting this whole thing for you and my video got knocked off. So I drew another one really quick and I'm going to show you these steps again. Oh my goodness. So we had just finished mixing our paints and I'm just going to show you on this little one here. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. And then I'll pick up on this one over here again. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put a glaze of buff Teton on the stems. And I'm just going to pick up a bunch on my brush. And I'm going to start at the top and just paint the whole thing with the buff Teton. A nice even glaze on the entire thing. Just the stems. I'm going right over the details that we drew. All the way down to the bottom. And while it's still wet, I'm going to pick up some of the raw umber and I'm just going to drop it in on the buff Teton underneath the cap where there's a shadow. And I'm going to pick up some more. I'm going to drop some here where there's a shadow from the other mushroom. Okay, and then drop in a little bit here where there's a shadow. Dry my brush off. Use the tip of my brush to make sure it goes right up to the edge of the cap. And then just sort of flick my brush through to soften it. And the same thing here. I'm using my brush to pull it all the way to the edge and then just soften the edges of the other shadows. Okay, so I have buff Teton and then I have a little bit of raw umber. I'm going to add a little bit more here because it's just not quite enough. Can't believe that happened. I don't know what happened. Okay, just pulling it through with the tip of my brush. And then I'm going to pick up buff Teton again and I'm going to paint the other stem. I'm leaving the cap alone. I'm just taking the buff Teton all the way up to the cap and then pulling it all the way down the stem of the mushroom. Pick up raw umber. Drop a little bit in up here under the cap and then a little bit here where it's in shadow. Dry my brush off and then make sure it's going all the way up under the cap. A little bit more. And just softening it. Okay, so that's all we need to do for the stems. Now for the cap, we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to use raw umber. So I'm going to mix up a little bit more because I used most of it when I painted the other one. Add some water to it. And we're going to paint the cap, not the under part, but just the cap. And I'm painting the cap with the raw umber that's diluted. Dry my brush off. I'm going to turn my paper a little bit. And then just make sure that my cap has that nice glaze of raw umber. Using the tip of my brush when it comes to the edges of the cap, taking it all the way down to where it meets the stem. Okay, so we have a glaze of raw umber. It doesn't have to be perfect, all right, because we're going to put another layer on, but we just want this one layer of diluted raw umber on those caps. Turn my paper and just make sure, using the tip of my brush, that it goes all the way to the edges. So basically we used buff Teton on the stems and a diluted raw umber on the caps. And then we also dropped in a little bit of raw umber underneath when the buff Teton was still wet, okay? And that gave us a little bit of a shadow underneath. So that is all we need to do for this step. We're going to let this completely dry, and then we're going to come back and I'm going to pick up with this set over here, which is just a better drawing. I took more time. All right, so finish these steps, let it dry completely, and then we'll come back and do the rest. Okay, so now this one is dry, and I'm going to go back to this one. I'm just going to put my palette here. There. And we've got the other paints over on this side. And so now we're going to continue on. And let me just, here, I want to use this. So we have our base layer on. And what we're going to do now is we're going to paint some detail on the stems, all right? And we're going to use the buff Teton. I'm going to actually move to my smaller brush. This is a size 4 pointed round. And I'm going to pick up buff Teton and then sort of dry my brush off and then pick up a little bit more. So I want a nice, even kind of brush load of buff Teton. And I'm going to start at the top, and if you noticed on your reference photo, there's little lines on the mushroom stem. So we're just going to take the tip of our brush and draw those little lines that we see. And they kind of curve a little bit. So I'm just putting a little bit through where it's in shadow and then bringing it down onto the stem. Pick up a little more buff Teton, and I'm just flicking my brush through randomly as I see it on my reference to give it a little bit more texture. Sometimes you'll see it a little bit darker, add a little bit more. And they're just little flicks of the brush straight up and down. And you'll follow the direction of form, just like we always talk about. Now, when I get down to this little part here, I'll stop and I'll just kind of go around it with the buff Teton, just to sort of enhance it a little bit. And then underneath, where it's brown, I'll add a little bit more buff Teton. And I'll take it all the way down to the bottom. You see it's kind of dark there. Okay, pick up a little bit more, then I'll go into this little kind of oval shape, and same thing, I'm just pulling down little flicks of my brush as I see it to darken that area, and it kind of curves over to in a left direction, so I'll slant the tip of my brush that way. I'm just drawing in these little lines that I see. They're very subtle. We'll put some raw umber on underneath it. Over here, I'll put more to darken that. And then up here, this is in shadow too, so I'm going to add quite a bit of buff Teton in this area. So it's just a little bit darker now, okay? Then I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I'll start underneath and start drawing those little lines. And again, this is very pale. We don't need a whole lot. But I'm noticing the direction that these lines go on the mushroom stem. And I'm just using the tip of my brush to flick those down. When I get down here, I'm just going to put a little bit more in this little section where it kind of has a darker appearance. And then the same over here, it's a little bit darker. And then in this section, they kind of slant to the left as well. Very, very subtle, okay? But it does make a difference. I'm going to go back over here and add a little bit more where it's darker. Little flicks of my brush. Okay, so that part is done. Now, we don't want to add the raw umber yet because it would be too dark and it would just spread onto the wet buff Titan. So we don't want to do that yet. We want to let this dry first. But what we can do is we can add in some of these darker bits with our raw umber. So I'm picking up that diluted raw umber and I'm just going to draw in where I see it a little darker. Flicks of my brush, just the tip of my brush, just drawing it in. There's a little bit over here too, just dot it in. Okay? That's all we need to do now for the stem. We're going to let that dry. But we can go up here now and we can paint the underside with a little bit of raw umber. And I'm just going to go in and draw a little line where I see it. Dry my brush off, I had too much paint. And just sort of fill in that space that's under the mushroom cap. So it looks a little bit darker than the rest. And then there's a little bit over here. I'm going to turn my paper so I have a better angle. And I'm going to paint in that shadow. I don't need to put a lot of detail there, but I just want it to look like it's underneath. So it's going to be a little bit darker than the rest. Okay. Now we can work on the cap. So the cap is a little bit different. And I want to go back to my bigger brush, or just a size 6 or a size 4, whatever you're comfortable with. And what we're going to do is we're going to put a water glaze down onto our cap. And I'm going to turn my paper this way so it's a little bit better for me, and I'm going to hold my reference the same direction so you'll turn your reference image. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put a water glaze down on top of the cap. So you want to be really careful. You want to get it all the way to the edge. So I put a little reservoir of water down and then I use the tip of my brush to bring it down to where it meets the stem. I don't want to go over. And I don't want to go into those dark areas that I just painted. So it's a nice water glaze over the entire upper cap. And then I'm going to pick up my raw umber and I'm going to drop in raw umber where I see it darker. So again, we don't have to be exact. It's about here, and then it kind of comes down and meets over here, and then it kind of wraps around this way. Dry my brush off, all right? Then I'm going to take the tip of my brush and make sure that my edges are nice and clean. So I'm just running the tip of my brush all the way around the cap to make sure my edge is nice. Everything else I'm going to leave alone. I'm going to let it just soften and granulate and do all of the wonderful things that it does. So now I'm going to do the same thing on the small cap. Put a little bit of water down in the center, sort of dry my brush off, and then bring that water all the way to the edge very carefully with the tip of my brush. Pick up my raw umber and drop it in where I see it darkest, so sort of up here and then down toward the front. Dry my brush off and once again just sort of go around the edges to make sure that they're nice and crisp. Now while I have it this way, I'm going to take a little bit more of the raw umber and go back into that under section where it's in shadow under the cap. And just make sure that's nice and clean. All right. So now our caps have enough contrast in them, okay? We're gonna let those dry, and we're gonna let our stems dry even more, and we'll be back to put on the final details. Okay, so this is dry enough now to add our final layer of detail. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mix up a little bit more of the raw umber. I'm gonna pick some up on my brush and put it in. So it's sort of transparent. I don't want it too dark. There's nothing on this mushroom that's that dark. All right, I'm gonna get my reference again, so you'll have your reference image. And I'm gonna look and see where I need more darkness. So I noticed on the cap that down here towards the bottom, there's a little bit of darker bits. And so I'm just gonna draw in where I see it dark, and then I'm going to use the tip of my brush, and I'm just using a dot motion. So I'm just sort of stippling in where I see it darker. So see, I'm just making little tiny dots here and there on the mushroom cap. I'm going to move my paint over and just turn my paper so I have a better angle. I'm always turning my reference to sort of match that. Because the raw umber is fairly transparent, when it dries it'll be a little bit lighter. But all I'm doing is adding a little bit of texture and darkness by just sort of dotting the paint here and there. Little tiny dots. You barely even need to reload your brush because a little bit goes a long way. But it's just giving it some texture. I'm going to move over here and put some dots over here where it's darker. See, I'm just barely touching it. Little tiny dots. And that's really all I need to do for the mushroom caps, okay? Now I do want to go underneath, grab some more of the raw umber, and just paint a little bit at the edges there, at the underneath of the cap, where we see it kind of go back underneath, just to make it a little bit darker. Then I'm going to take my brush and just flick through little tiny lines right from where the cap is in the direction that I see them. And then I'm going to look at my stem and say if there's any place that I need a little bit more, and I'm just going to flick through with my brush where I see some of those lines on the reference. And as they come down into these sections, I notice that it's quite a bit darker over here on the left side. So I'm going to add a little bit of the raw umber there where I see it darker, and then just sort of flick through to give it texture. So I'm doing the same thing that I did with the Buff Titan, but I'm doing it with the very diluted raw umber now. I see quite a bit here, so I'm going to add more. And then over here there's a little bit too. So as you see, it's almost like a dry brush. I'm just kind of skimming my brush over the top to make it darker where I see it darker. Now, It's also quite a bit darker where it's in shadow here, so I'm just going to flick my brush through. And if it gets too dark, I can wet my brush and dry it off and just sort of soften it in. It's quite a bit darker where the two mushrooms meet, so I'm going to take my raw umber and flick it through there. So anywhere where I see it darker, I'm using this raw umber to add in. I'm paying attention to the direction of form that I see. Tip of my brush. And then underneath the cap, same thing. It's a little too dark, so I rinse my brush, dry it off. And I just use the clean water to soften. But I still see lines. I'm going to put a little bit more here at the edge of my cap. And underneath, just soften. Okay. There. So that is really all I need to do for the details. If I want to add a little bit of depth, if I step back and look at my specimen, I notice it's a little darker here on these little dark bits, so I'll add in a little bit of dark. Okay? I see a little bit of dark here. And I can just go around and make sure that it's dark enough where I need it to be. But I'm really happy with this. Just going around, making sure that I have shadows where I need shadows. All right, so I'm really, really happy with this. So there's one final step that I want to do. And I want to put a unifying glaze, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up again in a clean part of my plate or my palette. I'm going to take some of this Buff Titan and put it in a separate part of my palette. And then I'm going to take a little tiny bit of the Ochre Leger or yellow ochre just to warm it up, and then add some water to it because I want it to be very transparent. I want it to be a glaze. So all that Ochre Leger did, or the yellow ochre did, is just warm up that Buff Titan a little bit. Plenty of water, just a lot of water. If I put this on a piece of paper, it's very transparent, okay? So I'm going to go over my whole mushroom stem right over all of the details, just really lightly with my brush, pulling down that unifying glaze. And it just warmed it up a little bit to make it look a little bit different than my cap. And it just sort of softens all of those marks that we made. There. And our mushrooms are done. So I hope you'll try this. It's a great thing to try. Mushrooms are beautiful this time of year. You can find different reference images of mushrooms and give this a try. It's a good way to learn how to do glazes and to work with pale colors and to put tiny fine details on something. Remember that we're not going for perfection or for a photographic copy of our specimen, but you can see that there's a resemblance here, and that's what we're going for. We're going for the illusion of these mushrooms, the essence of them. I hope you enjoyed this. Please feel free to share with me on social media. Tag me in your photos. I always love to see what you do. If you're not on social media, you can always send them to my email, ekateri.ewing@gmail.com. I hope you enjoyed this. Sorry about the little snafu with my camera. I'm not sure why that happened. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. It's a fun little project to try at this time of year. Thanks so much for being here. Take care.